Our text today comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. This week we are continuing the series we started last week on faith. And this is not a small subject. Scripture tells us without faith it is impossible to please God. So that means faith is not a secondary issue for the Christian life. It is absolutely foundational. And I'm sure that comes as no surprise. Well, Scripture does not leave for us faith undefined. In Hebrews 11:1, we are told, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen." Faith rests in what God has promised. Faith is convinced of realities that are yet not visible. It is confidence before sight. In other words, Christian faith, it sees Jesus for who he really is and responds accordingly, despite any circumstances or anything that otherwise might derail us. Now, if you want to see what real faith looks like, we can go through the Gospels and see what earned the Lord's approval. Notice when Jesus ever commends someone, he never praises the length of their theological explanation. He never praises a spotless moral resume. He never praises someone's religious position. He never says, "Well done, you who understand everything." But again and again, he praises whenever people put their faith in him. And faith not as this vague religious feeling, not faith as generic optimism, and not faith as mere intellectual agreement, but faith that results in movement and commitment on the part of that person. So, over the next several weeks in this series, we are going to be looking at different people in the Gospels who encountered Jesus and they completely entrusted themselves to him in kind of one manner or another. Even though these people often had very limited understanding of who Jesus was, or they found themselves in desperate circumstances and situations. Now, the story, this first faith story we're looking at today, may feel very familiar. We usually read this text in Matthew 2 during Advent, not during Lent. And as we should, it is part of the Christmas narrative. There are wise men or magi. There's gifts. There's a star. There's the nativity scene. But this morning, we are not coming to this text primarily as a Christmas time story. We're coming at it to examine the nature of faith. And in this text, there are really three striking examples of the wise men's faith, or of Magi's faith. The first is this: they believed without seeing. They believed without seeing. Notice in Matthew 2, faith does not begin with a miracle or a sermon. It begins with a star in the sky shining over a faraway land. Now, the wise men or magi, they were learned men from the East. They were likely scholars who studied the stars and ancient texts, and they served in royal courts. Well, they saw this star, and somehow, some way, they understood it to be a sign, likely tied to an ancient Hebrew prophecy. And from that small measure of light in the night sky, they had concluded that a king had been born. And so they sent out to follow that star, even though they had no firsthand experience of Israel's God. They had no eyewitness testimony of who God was. They had no miracle to confirm what they hoped was true. And they had no idea of how far they were going to have to travel following this star. Yet they began what turned out to be a very long journey. Not because everything was crystal clear, but because there was enough conviction in them to act, to move. And faith often begins like that. Not with total understanding, not with complete certainty and clarity, but with just enough light to move. And I think that is where this story begins to quietly press on us. Because we often want the full picture before we move, right? We want more answers. We want God to show us something more before we're ready to act on it. But faith will rarely give you the whole picture, because faith is going to forever dwell in the realm of things hoped for and things unseen, things that are not readily apparent to us or in our possession. Rather, when it comes to faith, we are merely given enough light to take the next step. And so here's the question for us as we engage this text. What is the next step of faith for you? Where are you stalled? Because maybe you're waiting for certainty instead of moving forward on trust. And perhaps it is a decision to trust Jesus Christ for salvation. You've heard the gospel and it makes sense, and there's a longing inside of you, but you don't want to be suckered into something. You don't want to look like a fool to trust in something that's, you're not still quite yet sure of. Perhaps that's where you're at. Or perhaps for some of you, you are stalled because, in some area of decision making or maybe taking a risk, you've prayed for guidance and wisdom, but you're stalled and you're stuck, not because God has been silent, but because you want absolute, unmistakable certainty. You want the sky to split open before you move. But the reality is, most of the time, faith moves under the light of a star and not in the bright, hot, blazing light of a spotlight. And so one thing we see here from the wise men is just move. It's to trust where the Lord is leading you, even if you can't see where that road ends, taking that next step. But faith is not only tested by what we see, it's also tested by what others refuse to see. The moment the Magi stepped into Jerusalem, something unexpected happened which would require the faith of the wise men to deepen. They believed despite unbelief. This is the second striking example of their faith, is that they believed despite unbelief. When they arrived, we can only assume that they expected to walk in on a great celebration, but they found disturbance. They would have expected confirmation at the end of their journey, but instead they found resistance. First, they found Herod, who was the puppet ruler of Judea installed by Rome, and he was greatly disturbed. He was threatened by the possibility of a rightful heir to the throne taking his place and his power and his wealth. He was disturbed by it, but it was more than him. It was all of Jerusalem was troubled. Among them were the chief priests and scribes, whom Herod had asked for details about the birth of Jesus in order to secretly plot his demise. And these religious leaders, when asked, could accurately quote Micah 5:2, which foretold that the Messiah, God's promised deliverer and king, would be born in Bethlehem. Now, what's so stunning here in Matthew 2 is that not one of them went to Bethlehem to see if it was true. They were informed, but unmoved. What a contrast. The Magi had just fragments of light, and yet they traveled hundreds of miles. The scribes had full access to all the scriptures and the prophecies, and they would not travel 5. And that contrast really, I think, tells us two things at once. One is the perseverance of true faith and the danger of spiritual indifference. Whereas the Magi kept moving toward Christ, others who had greater light remained seated. And I think that is the real quiet tragedy in this passage. Again, the scribes and priests, they had knowledge but no movement. They had truth without worship. And they could point other people to the Messiah, but without ever going and bowing before him themselves. And the danger here is not theoretical. I think this hits close to home. I would think most of the people who are going to be hearing this message in person and online already believe in Jesus. And so this message isn't necessarily a call to move from unbelief to belief in the most basic sense. I think rather this text comes to us as a warning, reminding us that it's possible to know Scripture, to know the story, and yet remain spiritually unmoved, to be near the truth, but yet never bow down to it. And so let me ask, where are you in your life close to the truth, but unmoved by it? Where are you 5 miles from Bethlehem? And for some of you, it's going to be obedience. You know what Scripture says. You know what Christ is calling you to do. But you delay. You negotiate. You soften the edges. And for some, it may be a matter of control, and you can trust Christ for all eternity and the salvation of your soul, but not when it comes to your calendar or your finances or your future or your family. I think in those places, for us, faith means recognizing who Jesus truly is and responding to him by entrusting yourself to him completely and then moving in the direction he has called you. Well, let's get back to the Magi. They were undeterred by the resistance and the apathy they found in Jerusalem. They believed even when the insiders did not. And their faith, we see, did not depend on, the approval of others. They weren't waiting for a consensus. They didn't just say, well, nobody here seems to be going. Let's head back home. They did not shrink away when others hesitated. They just kept moving. And I find that remarkable. But still, I would say this is not even the climax of their growing faith. Because despite what is often displayed in manger scenes, by the time the wise men finally arrived in Bethlehem, there were no shepherds there. There was no angelic chorus singing overhead. Matthew says they simply saw a house and a toddler who belonged to a poor Jewish family. This is sometime after the whole nativity scene, up to 2 years. We don't know how long. And when the wise men arrived, there was nothing about the scene that would have compelled them to belief. There was no palace, there was no throne, there was no visible sign of royalty. And yet, in spite of all of this, Matthew says they fell down and worshiped him. They fell down and worshiped him. And they believed when he appeared ordinary. This is the third striking example of their faith. They believed when Jesus appeared ordinary. Again, I think that's remarkable. Now, these were learned men. They were influential. They were accustomed to courts and kings, and they knew what power looked like. And this scene that they entered in on did not look like power. Jesus looked like any other child, any other poor kid in the entire world. And yet they fell down and worshipped, which the language is worships, like they literally bowed down. And then they opened up their boxes of treasure and gave it to Jesus until it was emptied. Why? Because they were not responding to appearances. They were responding to who Jesus truly was. Again, faith sees who Jesus truly is, and it responds accordingly. Now, by faith, the Magi saw a king where others saw a child. By faith, they saw glory where others would see obscurity, and they saw promise where others would see poverty. And again, this is a point where I think the story begins to turn on us. Because it's so easy to worship, when the heavens split open. It's harder to worship when heaven is silent. It's easy to believe when the signs are undeniable and there's great movements, but it's much harder to believe when everything appears ordinary. But at the end of the day, faith is trusting that Jesus is king, even when outward circumstances would seem to contradict it. And that's going to be true in all the stories we look at in this series. Whatever is going on, it would seem like that Jesus isn't the king. Yet people were able to entrust themselves to Jesus completely. And so here's the question. Will you trust Jesus? Will you entrust yourself to him when nothing in your circumstances encourages that trust? When prayers remain unanswered? When the waiting stretches longer and longer and longer than you ever expected? When the pain hurts and it's not being there's no relief to it, or when acts of obedience just result in loss. I think we all struggle at times to do this, to put our faith and trust in Jesus when kind of nothing seems to be happening. And maybe you're in that situation right now. There's something going on, and it's just like, man, I don't know if I can really, I have a lot of faith and trust in Jesus right now. And if so, let me remind you that faith does not rest upon visible proof, but revealed identity. That's really important. Faith does not rest upon visible proof, but revealed identity. In other words, you may not always see what Jesus is doing, but you can always be sure of who he is. Let me say that again. You may not always be able to see what Jesus is doing, but you can always be sure of who he is. So bow anyway. Trust anyway. Obey anyway. Not because your situation makes sense, but because Jesus is King. So with that in mind, I want to just close with a final thought to hopefully bolster your assurance and conviction, to help you grow your faith. Now, the Magi, they bowed down before hidden glory. They only saw a child, and they worshiped. We see far more. We see the cross, where the King bore the judgment our unbelief deserved. We see the empty tomb, where Jesus overcame the shackles and prison of death for us. We see the risen Christ seated at the right hand of the Father, ruling in authority over all creation, bringing everything together according to his purpose and will. And what was veiled to those wise men has been unveiled to us, which means our faith in Jesus shouldn't be smaller than theirs. It should be far greater, because they bowed before a promise. We bow before fulfillment. They trusted with just fragments of light, and we trust in the full, glorious, illuminated revelation of the King who has conquered sin and death. And with that, let me challenge you. Do not settle for a faith that merely affirms doctrine, that you just agree about the right things about God. Don't stand near Bethlehem and never bow down. Rather, let faith move your feet, bend your knees, and open up the treasure that is your life and give it all to Jesus. Because that's what faith does. It sees who Jesus is, the glorious crucified and risen King, and it responds accordingly. May your faith grow, and may you always see Jesus truly as the King and the Lord of your life, and to take heart and be full of that assurance and conviction that only comes with faith.